Mirbat, Oman, July 19, 1972. 5:30. The monsoon is running low across the coastal plain. Rain thins the darkness into gray. Visibility 200 meters. Enough to move, not enough to see what is moving. 300 armed fighters are already inside that gray. Inside the fort, 9 men from B Squadron, 22 SAS are at their positions. 25 Omani gendarmerie, 30 local fighters. 64 people between the town of Mirbat and the largest PFLOAG assault of the entire Dhofar War. 500 meters from the fort wall, a 25-pounder field gun sits in an open sandbag emplacement. No roof, no cover. Designed to be operated by 3 men. Its Omani crew is already down, 1 dead in the first mortar barrage, 1 wounded and unable to continue. Corporal Talaiasi Labalaba, a Fijian soldier serving in the British Army, looks at the empty gun from the fort wall. No order is given. No one requests it. No tactical discussion occurs. He picks up his weapon, climbs over the wall, and runs 500 meters across open ground while mortars are falling. He reaches the gun alone. For the next 90 minutes, 300 men cannot take it from him. The Dhofar War did not make the international news. That was by design. Britain's military presence in Oman operated under a classification that kept the conflict out of public record for years. Soldiers deployed as advisors. Casualties reported through channels that did not produce headlines. What was happening in the southern province of Oman through the late 1960s and early 1970s was a communist insurgency backed by South Yemen and supported by training facilities in China, and the British government had decided that the most effective way to fight it was quietly. The PFLOAG, the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, had by 1972 established control over significant portions of the Dhofar interior. Their fighters were not poorly equipped irregulars. They had been trained in Chinese and Yemeni camps, armed with DShK 12.7mm heavy machine guns, 82mm mortars, RPGs, and AK-47s. They understood coordinated assault. They had studied the positions they intended to attack. Mirbat was chosen with deliberate logic. A coastal town, isolated, connected to the outside by routes that could be observed and timed. The British Army training team, presence there was 9 men. Small enough to overwhelm before reinforcement aircraft could respond. The Dhofar monsoon season further narrowed the air response window, low cloud, poor visibility, conditions that grounded rotary support or delayed it long enough to be irrelevant. The plan was straightforward in its arithmetic. 250 fighters, possibly 300, against 64. Attack before first light. Suppress the fort with mortar and heavy machine gun fire. Breach the perimeter wire. Overrun before the sun was fully up. The PFLOAG commander knew how many defenders were inside Mirbat. He did not know that the 9 men among them wore sand-colored berets and had passed a selection process designed to find people who perform differently when the arithmetic stops working in their favor. That distinction did not appear in his intelligence assessment. It should have been the first thing on it. The problem was not the numbers. The problem was what the numbers were assumed to mean. 300 fighters against 64 defenders is a ratio that, on paper, resolves in one direction. Military planning operates on force ratios for good reason. They predict outcomes with reliable consistency across enough engagements that they have become foundational to how commanders think about assault operations. 4-to-1 is not a guarantee, but it is, in most contexts, sufficient. Add surprise, add darkness, add a monsoon that grounds air support, add a heavy weapons advantage in mortars and crew-served machine guns, and the number stops being a prediction. It becomes a conclusion drawn before the operation begins. The PFLOAG commander had drawn that conclusion. His plan reflected it. 30 minutes to overwhelm. Withdraw before daylight fully established and before British air assets could respond. Clean. Decisive. Numerically inevitable. What the ratio could not account for was a variable that does not appear in order of battle assessments. The 9 SAS soldiers at Mirbat were not simply better trained than the defenders the PFLOAG had overrun before. They were trained for a specific condition, the condition where the plan has failed, where the numbers have turned, where every rational calculation says the position cannot be held. SAS selection does not filter for soldiers who perform well when conditions are favorable. It filters for soldiers who perform differently when conditions are not. The distinction is not motivational. It is functional. It changes what a person does in the seconds after the situation exceeds the plan. Labalaba running 500 meters across open ground under mortar fire was not a heroic impulse. It was a problem being solved by the only person close enough to solve it. The 25-pounder was the fort's only weapon capable of breaking assault formations at distance. Without it, the perimeter wire would not hold. Without the wire, 64 people become 64 targets. The logic was simple. The execution was not. The PFLOAG's assumption had been that suppressing the fort would suppress the gun. They were correct about the fort. They were wrong about the gun because they had no framework for a single operator maintaining fire from a crew-served weapon while wounded, in an open emplacement, under concentrated fire, for 90 minutes. Their intelligence had counted the defenders. It had not counted what the defenders were willing to do. The SAS did not arrive in Dhofar to fight. They arrived to make fighting unnecessary. The British Army training team concept, BAT, was not a euphemism designed to obscure a combat presence, though it served that function in public. It was a genuine operational philosophy built from a specific lesson the SAS had drawn across 2 decades of unconventional warfare, that the most durable victories in insurgency environments are not won by killing insurgents. They are won by removing the conditions that produce them. Train the local force. Build the relationship. Make the population the perimeter. In Dhofar, this meant SAS teams living in the towns they were assigned to, learning Arabic, running medical clinics, training the Firkat, former PFLOAG fighters who had defected and could now be turned into the most effective counterinsurgency asset available, because they knew the terrain, the tactics, and the people better than any outside force could learn in a decade. 9 men at Mirbat were not 9 men waiting for a fight. They were 9 men embedded in a community, training a local force, running a civil affairs operation that was slowly turning the population of coastal Dhofar away from the insurgency. The 25-pounder in the emplacement 500 meters from the fort wall was not their primary weapon. It was their last one. This is the doctrine that makes Mirbat legible. Not as a story of individual courage, though it is that, but as a story of what happens when a small force built around a specific philosophy encounters a large force built around a different one. The PFLOAG had mass. They had training. They had a plan calibrated to mass and training. What they did not have was a framework for an opponent who had already decided, before the first mortar round fell, that the position would be held regardless of what the mathematics said. That decision was not made on July 19th. It was made during selection, refined during training, and embedded so deeply in the operational culture of B Squadron that it did not require discussion when the moment arrived. Labalaba did not hold a meeting at the fort wall. He looked at the gun. He ran. The doctrine was already inside him before he moved. July 19th, 1972. 5:30. The first mortar round lands 50 meters from the fort wall. The bat house comes alive in under 3 minutes. 9 men, positions assigned, weapons up before the second salvo. The monsoon is still running. Rain thin enough to see through, heavy enough to muffle the sound of 300 fighters moving across the coastal plain toward the perimeter wire. Sergeant Bob Bennett takes the roof. The radio goes to Sergeant Roger Chapman. Captain Mike Keeley, the 23-year-old officer commanding the Mirbat bat, begins working the net, trying to raise headquarters at Salalah, trying to request air support through cloud cover that makes the request academic for at least an hour. 500 meters away, in the sandbag emplacement that was never designed to be defended by one man, the 2 Omani gunners who were supposed to be operating the 25-pounder are down. One is dead. One cannot continue. The gun is silent. Labalaba sees it from the fort wall. He does not report the situation upward. He does not request guidance. He picks up his weapon, goes over the wall, and runs. 500 meters of open coastal plain. No cover. No defilade. Mortar rounds are walking across the ground between the fort and the emplacement as the PFLOAG zeroes its fire. Labalaba runs through the pattern, not around it, through it, because around it does not exist on flat ground, and the gun is at the end of a straight line, and the straight line is the only option. He reaches the emplacement. The 25-pounder field gun is a weapon built for a 3-man crew. One loads, lifting 11-kilogram shells from the ready rack, ramming them home. One lays, adjusting elevation and traverse by hand crank, reading the bubble level, compensating for the gun's recoil displacement after each shot. One fires, pulling the lanyard, managing the recoil, calling corrections. 3 distinct tasks, each requiring both hands, each time to the others. The weapon's rate of fire assumes all 3 positions are filled. Labalaba fills all 3. The first round goes downrange at approximately 550. the assault formations that have been moving steadily toward the perimeter wire check. Not from fear, from the physical reality of an artillery round detonating in their center. The PFLOAG commander, watching through binoculars from the rear of his formation, adjusts. He redirects heavy machine gun fire toward the emplacement. DShK rounds, 12.7 millimeters, capable of defeating light cover, begin chewing into the sandbag wall. Inside the emplacement, Labalaba continues. Load. Lay. Fire. The sequence is slower than designed. One pair of hands doing 3 jobs, the gun shifting on its spade with each shot, each correction taking longer than the crew manual assumes. But the rounds are going out, and each round that goes out is buying the fort wall another 30 seconds. At approximately 6:15, Labalaba takes his first wound. A round, fragment, small arms. The after-action report does not specify precisely. Opens a cut on his face significant enough to bleed heavily, but not enough to stop his hands. He does not call for medical evacuation. He calls for ammunition. The radio message that comes back to the bat house is 4 words. Send more ammunition. Not send help. Not send men. Ammunition. Because the gun is still running and the gun needs feeding, and that is the problem in front of him, and he is solving it in sequence. Captain Keeley makes the decision to send Trooper Tommy Tobin forward with ammunition and support. Tobin moves across the same 500 meters under the same fire. He reaches the emplacement. He takes a wound on approach, serious, jaw and neck, and reaches the gun anyway. 2 men now, neither fully operational. The gun continues. Inside the fort, Bennett on the roof is working the Browning .50 caliber, engaging the PFLOAG's DShK positions, trying to reduce the volume of fire directed at the emplacement. Chapman is on the radio, cycling through emergency frequencies, talking to Salala, talking to anyone who can authorize the air support that the cloud ceiling is currently blocking. Keeley has moved forward himself, low, using the terrain as it exists, which is to say barely, to reach the gun position and coordinate. The PFLOAG's mortar teams have found their range. At approximately 7:45, a direct mortar strike hits the emplacement. The gun goes silent. 90 seconds. The PFLOAG commander lowers his binoculars. His formation, which has been taking artillery fire for nearly 2 hours from a position that should have been suppressed within the first 30 minutes, begins to reform for the final push. The wire is close. The fort wall beyond it is reachable. 2 hours late, but reachable. The gun fires again. Labalaba, wounded twice, has cleared whatever the mortar round damaged and returned to the sequence. Load. Lay. Fire. The formation checks again. The commander raises his binoculars again. He does not understand what he is seeing. At approximately 8:15, Labalaba is hit a 3rd time. This wound does not allow continuation. Trooper Tobin, himself severely wounded, holds the position alone. Keeley is in the emplacement now, providing what fire he can with his personal weapon, working the radio with his other hand, talking the air support down through a cloud base that has lifted, barely, enough, as the morning progresses. At 9 o'clock, the helicopters arrive. G Squadron SAS, airlifted from Salala. They come in fast and low, fanning out from the landing zone with the specific controlled aggression of people who have been listening to the radio traffic for 3 hours and know exactly what they are arriving to relieve. The PFLOAG, which has been pressing the perimeter for 3.5 hours, encounters a force that is fresh, oriented, and coming from a direction they did not account for. The assault breaks. 38 PFLOAG fighters are confirmed dead on the plane. Wounded and missing push the total significantly higher. The remainder withdraw into the Dhofar interior. The fort is intact. The gun is silent now, finally, not because it was suppressed, but because the men who kept it running can no longer stand beside it. Labalaba is dead. Tobin will survive his wounds, but will not fully recover. 2 other SAS soldiers are wounded. The Omani gendarmerie have taken casualties across the perimeter. The Furkat fighters held their positions. The 25-pounder sits in its emplacement, barrel still warm, surrounded by spent casings that tell the story of what 90 minutes looks like when counted in rounds fired by 1 man against 300. 9 o'clock, July 19, 1972. The helicopters are on the ground. By 9:30, the coastal plain outside Mirbat is quiet in the way ground is quiet after it has been fought over, not peaceful, but exhausted. 38 PFLOAG fighters confirmed dead in the open. The wounded and missing carried back into the Dhofar interior by a force that had arrived at the wire with 300 men and left without the fort. The fort had not fallen. Corporal Talaiasi Labalaba, B Squadron, 22 SAS, died at the gun position at approximately 8:15. He had been wounded at least twice before the third and final hit. He had not left the emplacement between his arrival and his death. The 25-pounder had been firing for the duration. Trooper Tommy Tobin survived. The wounds to his jaw and neck were severe. He did not return to operational duty. He had reached the emplacement while already hit, had held his position alongside Labalaba, and had continued after Labalaba fell. His name appears less frequently in accounts of Mirbat than it should. 2 SAS soldiers killed, 2 wounded. The Omani gendarmerie and Firkat had held the perimeter through the full assault. The British government did not publicly acknowledge the battle for years. The Dhofar campaign remained classified. Labalaba received a mention in dispatches. The recommendation for a Victoria Cross was declined. The reasoning given referenced insufficient witness documentation, a classification system consuming its own record. The PFLOAG never again launched a direct assault on a position held by British forces. That decision, made somewhere in the Dhofar interior after July 19th, is the outcome that matters most. After Mirbat, the PFLOAG changed its strategy. Not immediately, not with a formal announcement. But the operational pattern that emerged in the months following July 19th was unmistakable to anyone tracking it. Direct assault on fortified positions with BAT presence stopped. The large coordinated attacks, the kind that required massing 300 fighters, moving them across open ground, committing to a frontal engagement, disappeared from the PFLOAG's operational repertoire. What replaced them was smaller, less exposed, more patient. Ambush, assassination, propaganda. The tactics of an organization that had encountered something it could not solve with the tools it had, and had drawn the correct conclusion. This is what defeat looks like when it comes from a single gun position held by one man for 90 minutes. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself in what the enemy stops attempting. The Dhofar War ended in 1976 with the PFLOAG effectively broken as a military force. The SAS campaign, small teams, embedded in communities, training local forces, running medical programs alongside direct action, is studied in counterinsurgency doctrine as one of the few examples of an insurgency being defeated comprehensively rather than merely suppressed. Mirbat did not win that campaign, but it marked the moment when the campaign's outcome became visible, when the PFLOAG strategic logic encountered a limit it had not planned for and could not recalculate around. The question that Mirbat leaves, the one that SAS instructors return to when they describe what selection is actually looking for, is not whether courage can be trained. It is whether the specific decision Labalaba made at the fort wall can be produced reliably, in the right person, at the right moment, under conditions that make every rational calculation point the other direction. The long drag through the Brecon Beacons does not answer that question. It finds the people for whom the question has a different weight. That is the only answer available. And at Mirbat, on a coastal plain in Oman in 1972, it was enough.